Hello everyone, this will be the lecture for Act 3 of Richard III. I'm sure you're all heartbroken that we couldn't meet in class, but do want to overview some of this, and please don't forget to respond in the comments to, up your daily grade. Um, there are some passages that I'm going to highlight. They won't show up on the screen, so have the book handy or have a text handy, and I'll basically highlight some of the important text from this act. And so in 3.1, we pick up where Richard intercepts the prince, the prince to be Prince Prince Edward, um, and it's a very political move, and there's a lot of almost double speak, I guess you could say, if you want to use the Orwellian term, anachronistically, about the nature of Richard gathering up the princes. We're swooping them up. In fact, there's one of the young York actually starts out in Sanctuary. In fact, we left off at the end of Act Two with Elizabeth and her, um, and young York taking Sanctuary with the help of the Cardinal. But if you look on, let's see, this is page 234, Act Three, Scene One, lines 45 through 55. You see that the lengths that Buckingham and Richard are willing to go to get their way is to even flout the decrees of the church and the privilege of sanctuary, which during that time, if you were in the church, you cannot be arrested or taken away. And they actually find a loophole saying that the prince never claimed sanctuary and that children couldn't claim sanctuary, so they are able to wrestle the prince away. If you look at the notes, there's also some notes about the anachronistic nature of Buckingham's objections to the cardinal, about his language is more Protestant, and during this time the Protestant Reformation hadn't happened yet, around 1470s to 1480s. The Reformation was in the 15 teens. Now, if you go next to 236, you get to start seeing some of the double talk that pervades the rest of scene one. For instance, Gloucester even equates himself with with the character of Vice from medieval plays, where he moralizes two meanings in one word, such as "without characters, fame lives long." And in a way, the fame of this prince does live long because we don't know what happened to them, and there's no written record of it. So they're famous for basically being, their fates being unknown. And we see that Richard also has the intention of killing them, pretty much. The suggestion here is that they're very young and at the age of children, and he wants to kill them. So why so young? They say do never live long, around line 80 in this scene, or even later on page 238, lines 116, where they talk about where young York is pestering his uncle Richard, saying, "Oh, my kind uncle, that I know will give, and being but a toy, which is not a gift to give. A greater gift than that I'll give my cousin," says Richard. A greater gift? Oh, that's the sword to it. And we know, because of Richard's intentions, that what young York doesn't see is that he might be actually meaning that a sword to it, a real sword, probably across his neck or something of that nature. And then you got another draw on page 239 around line 130, where young Orc likens himself to a little ape that is, and likens Richard to a circus performer, which is interesting. It's funny. It brings Richard low, but we know he has much higher aims and much more. He's not so jocular as young York seems to treat him. Or if it is, they even suspect this being an insult devised by Queen Elizabeth, um, who, as we know, Edward the Fourth's wife, is enemy to Gloucester. Well, I think it's in one of the scenes in Act Three that uh, Elizabeth Woodville's some of her kinsmen, like Rivers, get executed. Or on page 240, you get more of the same kind of banter. Like one of the princes is afraid of sleeping in the tower, which was actually customary for people to actually sleep there as well as being a place for a prison. So it's not unusual. They have nothing to really suspect that they're going to be in the tower, but for Richard's purposes, it's obviously to keep them under wraps, as we see later on. And one of the young princess is scared of Clarence's angry ghost, and we know Clarence is the one who was killed and drowned in a wine barrel. And the prince, Prince Edward says, "I fear no uncle's dead," and Richard says, "Nor none that live, I hope." And of course, that's just a cheap laugh that we know that um, he's the one that should be feared. Excuse me. Um, yeah, and on 243, towards the end of scene one, you see kind of the compact why Buckingham is going along with helping Richard to the crown, because that's the plan. He's going to be king. This is King Richard III, and he's helping him to the crown. And Richard, Duke of Gloucester, has promised Buckingham the Earl of, social advancement, the Earl of Hereford, and the possessions of lands that come with that. On page 244, scene 2, around line 9 and 10, you have here a very interesting dream. In fact, there's something almost kind of a supernatural, superstitious kind of significance in this play. We had Margaret's Curse in, the earlier acts, and here we have this almost prophetic dream from Lord Stanley, where he tries to warn Hastings that he had a dream of he dreamt tonight that the boar raised his helm. The boar is the symbol of Richard, Richard of Gloucester. Um, Besides, he says there are two, and we've already known that they have two councils held, divided councils, and that may be determined at one, which may take you and him to rue at the other. And Stanley wants to get the hell out of there. He's suspicious. He does not trust the dream, and the dream causes him to distrust Richard. And we know, because we're Richard's confidants, that that's actually good advice. Hastings, however, is very trusting. Around lines 20, for instance, he dismisses the dream, and believes that Richard has their good in mind. In fact, all the way leading up to Hastings' eventual execution, there is lots of irony about his statements because they're completely to the contrary. In fact, there's almost a show of good faith around lines close to lines fit between 45 and 50, where Catesby informs Hastings that his enemies, the Woodville's relatives, Rivers, and the others, will be executed. Because they're the ones who, if you remember the beginning of the play, Hastings was in prison, and he had just got released. And it was because of the Woodvilles that he was there. Yeah, Rivers, Vaughan, and Gray were the ones who were executed. In fact, if you look around line 66, for instance, with some men else who think themselves as safe as thou and I, who as thou knowest are dear to princely Richard and to Buckingham. He estimates himself as being so dear that we're safe, we're secure, and that continues on, even close to between lines 75 and 80. My lord, I hold my life as dear as you do yours. And he's talking to Stanley here. And never in my life, I do protest, was it more precious to me than 'tis now. Thank you, but I know that our state's secure. I would be so triumphant as I am. And of course, Stanley tries to say that Rivers, Vaughan, and Gray were secure, but look at them now. They were charged with treason and executed. And of course, this is all very there's a dark humor that runs throughout Richard III. There's some horrible acts that take place, but throughout all that, there is this dark humor, especially the undercutting the expectations of certain characters like Hastings, who eventually ends up getting beheaded. In fact, I think his head is actually brought on stage in some productions. In fact, it's 3.3 where you get the execution of Rivers, Gray, and Vaughan, and Rivers even mentions the curse, and he hopes for it to kind of be to have it visited on others as well. Let's see. If we go to page 254, scene 4, between lines 35 and 40. There's the mention of the strawberries where he asked the bishop to go get the strawberries and bring them hither. And it's a symbolic reference to, anecdote at the time, where if you reach for strawberries on the ground, beware the adder underneath. And so it's symbolic of what Richard's going to do to Hastings. Like he has a very carefree manner when he first comes in, but underneath that carefree manner is a serpent ready to strike out, because that is the deception and the stratagems of someone like Richard. In fact, Hastings is, like Clarence, is very deceived. In lines 55 in scene 4. I think there's never a man in Christendom can lesser hide his love or hate than he, for by his face straight shall you know his heart. Saying that he can know Richard by his, he can know Richard's heart by his face. Um, we'll see something similar to that when we read Macbeth. That's a similar kind of idea that gets addressed, but yeah, Stanley's not really very uh, trusting of that. But Hastings is just almost kind of blindly trusting. In fact, he falls into Richard's trap about, and again, kind of tying in with the themes of the dream, the curse, and then Richard, of course, manipulates that too, and accusing someone of witchcraft and withering his arm. He says it was Elizabeth Woodville and um, Jane Shore, who was a mistress of Hastings, which is why Hastings says if they have done this thing, my gracious lord. It's around between lines 65 and 80. He asks about who deserves some, and his arm, as the note says, has been withered for all his life, at least according to some sources. Um, and so when he says, one little word of if costs him his life and gets him avowed as a traitor. He said, off with his head now by St. Paul, and of course I take Hastings out. In fact, Hastings has some interesting lines on page 259, scene 5. Um, I think, before he dies, he has some insight to offer. Um, close about line 101, which it's actually on 258. O momentary state of worldly men, which we more hunt for than the grace of heaven. Who builds his hope in air of your fair looks lives like a drunken sailor on a mast, ready with every knot to tumble down into the fatal bowels of the deep. Come, lead me to the block, bear him my head. They smile at me that shortly shall be dead. So, and it's interesting. He notes the vanity of seeking for, to try build hopes on earth, because you can't really trust other people, is what he says. In fact, he even says that people who will smile at his execution, like he smiled at the execution of Grey, Rivers and Fawn, will themselves might be next on the chopping block, even though they don't know it. So there's a lot of a lot of surprise to be taken with that. In fact, in scene 5, around lines 20 through 25, you get to see the feigned surprise of Richard, and that's even more. It's more comedic and it's disturbing at the same time, because it's a black humor where, you know, they were so surprised that Hastings was such a traitor, but of course he was executed on a very hasty pretense. In fact, before the Lord Mayor is kind of just a puppet here in this play. He's a puppet figure and nothing more, really. In fact, he kind of bends to the will of Richard and Buckingham. Um, in fact, they claim that Hastings daubed his vice with a show of virtue near line 30, when it's actually, of course, it's Richard who's doing it at this very moment. So it's almost a double irony. In fact, it's lines 50 through 60 kind of indicate that we were going to wait for him. We were going to wait till we executed him so you could come and hear his confessions, but our friends were a little too hasty. And they killed him before you could get here. Oh, what a shame. Okay. Now, if we go to page 267, or scene 7, we're getting close to the end here. Scene 7 has some pretty good comedy as well. And that, Buckingham does Richard's bidding, tries to infer the bastardy of Edward's children, and maybe even the bastardy of Edward himself, claiming that Richard's father was out at wars when Edward was born. And of course, it's supposed to be a rallying cry. He's supposed to be the orator that kind of gets people on Richard's side. And of course, when Richard asks, did they say, God save Richard, England's royal king? And Buckingham can only respond, "No, so God help me, but like dumb statues or breathing stones, gazed each on other and looked deadly pale." So there seems to be some ambivalence about Richard taking the crown here. And if we go on, let's see. Let's see. In fact, 270 on around 270 lines 55 is where we see uh, Richard feigning benevolence, and he acts as if he's a religious ascetic who would rather not have the throne. In fact, this goes on for a while. Until finally we know that this is all just kind of a melodrama. It's a ploy to make him seem more devout than he really is, so that he could be trusted with the state. And in reality, we know he's a monster who will do anything. So he's manipulating religion, the outward show of religion, in order to get his crown. Okay, I think that's pretty good for now. In fact, we end Act 3 with Richard becoming king. And, we'll go on from there. So if you have any questions, feel free to send them